They never knew the weight of silence until they heard hers, until the woman who once lit Earth's diplomatic stage with a voice forged in fire and raised in the ashes of war stood in the heart of the galactic convocation and said nothing, not even when her name was spoken in 100 alien tongues, not even when her species was blamed for instability, not even when the assembly demanded she explain why humanity's fleets had stopped transmitting. She remained still, unmoving, unreadable, with eyes that held the quiet wrath of a storm waiting for its time, a silence not born from fear or weakness, but from grief so complete it had rewritten the laws of presence, and every diplomat in the chamber felt its gravity. They did not see a woman, they saw a signal, a monument in living form. Her uniform still bore the scorch marks from the orbital strike. Her right hand remained bandaged from pulling her son's body from the fire, and around her neck hung a silver locket that opened to a grainy photo of a child now lost to politics, betrayal, and war masked as peace. And though no sound left her lips, species across the stars began arguing not over what she had said, but over what her silence must mean. They debated on news channels and warships, on dying worlds and trading posts. Scholars called it the doctrine of the mute earthborn. Soldiers whispered she was the tip of a spear still sheathed, and somewhere in the corners of frightened empires, artificial minds modeled her probability for retaliation. None dared speak to her directly, not after what happened on day 2, when the Inari ambassador, attempting to dismiss her as ceremonial, referred to her son as collateral consequence. And in that moment her eyes lifted, meeting his with a gaze like compressed lightning, and though she did not flinch, did not blink, did not say a word, the ambassador collapsed into convulsions, foaming at the mouth, eyes boiling in their sockets, dead within minutes, cause unknown, though every medic insisted she had never moved. That was when the whispers began that her silence was not empty, but weaponized, that humanity had evolved something unseen, something unquantifiable, born from trauma and buried in the human subconscious, a new form of diplomacy shaped not by treaties, but by raw presence, and the council, for all its logic and protocols, began to fracture beneath the weight of not knowing. They feared her, not because of what she had done, but because she had done nothing and still changed everything. Behind the scenes, the assembly's security began running neural containment scans on every human delegate, but none would speak. Either they had taken a vow in her name, in his name, the child whose death had gone unpunished, unacknowledged, and unresolved. It had been labeled a strategic misfire by the Brelthian Republic, a glitch in planetary targeting systems during an Earth Council defense simulation, but the woman knew better, and the silence she carried was not passive. It was surgical. It was the last defense of a mother whose screams had become too dangerous to be heard. In the days following her arrival, planetary alliances began to shift. Small systems withdrew from trade agreements with the Brelthians. Others sent quiet inquiries to Earth, asking for assurance, for mercy, for time, because without a single broadcast or fleet mobilization, humanity had suddenly become the axis of fear and hope alike, and still she said nothing. Surveillance drones recorded her every breath. Intelligence analysts tried to decipher her posture, the frequency of her blinks, the tilt of her head, each theory more desperate than the last. And in those hours, in those conferences, behind closed quantum, encrypted doors, the phrase began to surface again and again: she is the consequence. They said, she is what happens when you kill something sacred and pretend the stars will forgive you. And those words reached ears far from the center of power, to mining colonies and agricultural moons, to children who watched in silence as their parents cried for a boy they never knew. Back on Earth, vigils burned for days. Cities dimmed their lights in synchrony, and every human diplomat now wore black bands over their voices, not as mourning, but as unity, an unspoken declaration that the era of explanation was over. Now the galaxy would listen. On the third day, the council tried again. A senior Gyrak, 3 centuries old and respected as a neutral scholar, approached her on trembling limbs and asked gently, "What do you require from us?" And she turned to him slowly, like a mountain deciding to shift after an age of stillness, and with nothing but a glance, she pointed to the center of the convocation, the place where truth must be spoken aloud, under oath, with the entire galaxy watching. And it was understood in that moment that she did not want revenge. She wanted revelation, not retribution, but reckoning. And the assembly froze, because they realized she would not be the one to speak. She would force them to confess. Across the stars, ancient races who had once ruled with logic and conquest now found themselves paralyzed by the quiet weight of a single human mother's refusal to let the universe move on. She was immovable, eternal in her pain, and every second she stood there, silent, was a reminder that peace built on denial is not peace, it is delay. Behind her, the Earth delegation stood like statues, waiting, watching, backing her not with weapons, but with shared silence. And far above them, in orbit, the human flagship hung motionless, its weapons cold but its targeting systems warm, aimed not at enemies, but at truth itself. By day 5, the council chambers began to empty, delegates falling ill, hallucinating, panicking, unable to withstand the pressure of their own guilt projected onto her motionless form. For in silence she had become a mirror, and those who looked saw not her pain, but their complicity. And yet, despite all of it, despite the dead child, the broken treaties, dissolving alliances, she stood silent, unshaken, eternal. And as the galactic newsfeeds filled with speculation and panic, one final image emerged. The locket around her neck, its photo burned at the edges, and inscribed inside were 5 words etched in human script: "You mattered. They will know." And that night, across the furthest reaches of known space, as artificial stars blinked over dying worlds, every species understood one thing: she was not here to negotiate. She was here to witness. And the witnessing had only just begun. They thought perhaps time would dull the gravity of her presence, that on the second rotation of the station's artificial sun, her silence might fracture, bend, or fray into speech, but time only amplified her, sharpening the edges of her stillness until it cut through protocol and pierced every shield of politics and ceremony the council had built over centuries. She stood again, same place, same posture, with the locket resting above her heart and the bandage on her hand now stained faintly red where the edges reopened. A quiet wound that healed slower than flesh should, because some wounds do not belong to the body, they belong to memory, and memory had not forgiven the galaxy. By now, whispers of her name had traveled further than any ambassador's voice, translated into dialects that barely had words for grief, carried on pirate broadcasts and smugglers' tongues, etched into the side of cargo freighters and whispered in prison cells by those who once cursed Earth's arrogance and now found themselves praying it would not come for them, not with ships, not with warheads, but with her, just her, the woman who said nothing and in doing so made the stars flinch. Council chambers had changed. Seats once occupied were now empty, some delegates withdrawn, others vanished without explanation, and those who remained had stopped trying to address her directly, instead speaking around her, over her, through her, as if she were a monument they could not acknowledge without admitting their shame. But she heard everything. Her silence was not absence. It was amplification, and behind her eyes, the weight of every word, every lie, every cowardly justification folded into the deepening silence like iron into molten steel. Then came the breach, not an act of war, but a signal from Earth, encrypted beyond even Council capabilities, broadcast not from a flagship or a political body, but from a small civilian vessel parked outside the convocation perimeter. The sender was her husband, face hollowed by days of orbital grief, and his message was played aloud, not because he asked, but because the station's systems began to fail if it was silenced, as if the signal itself was fused with some deeper code, some command written in the language of inevitability. His voice cracked as he spoke of their son, his name, Arlen, his dreams of being the first human to swim in the oceans of Keltharis Prime, his obsession with the moons of Valth, and how he would draw them over and over until his walls were papered with alien tides, the boy who had worn a diplomatic pin at age 7 and declared to his mother one day, "I will speak for Earth with a voice so loud the stars cannot ignore me." And then came the photo, not grainy like the one in her locket, but clear and vibrant, projected across the chamber's ceiling like a funeral painted in light, a laughing boy with bright eyes, clutching a carved wooden star his father had made for him, standing in front of the very same council hall. On his first visit off Earth, unaware that the building would one day fall silent in his name, the chamber remained frozen, no one daring to speak, until the boy's father, choking back tears, said, "He believed the galaxy was good. You proved him wrong. Now my wife carries his silence, so you never forget it." And then the signal cut, not abruptly, but with a finality that felt like closing a coffin, and in the stillness that followed, something shifted not in her, but in them. The Brelthian delegation stood, finally, their leader, a grizzled tactician named Harkel, voice like rusted machinery and eyes that had seen empires fall, and he dared to step forward, breaking the invisible line that had formed between her and the rest of the galaxy, and in a voice trembling with fear disguised as protocol, he offered the first words of apology, though even as he spoke them, the universe knew it was not enough. He said the strike was accidental, a glitch in the command relay, a misidentification of orbital metadata. But the moment he uttered the phrase acceptable margin of error, every light in the chamber flickered as if the station itself recoiled, and she raised her head slightly, not to challenge, but to acknowledge, and in that motion alone, the Brelthian's voice broke, his words trailing into silence, because there was something in her gaze that unmade lies, and for the first time since the war with the Drevians, Harkel wept, not for the boy, but for himself, for what he had become in the name of stability. And as he sat back down, shattered by his own guilt, the woman remained upright, her silence no longer passive, but electric, humming with a resonance that some sensitive species began to register physically: vertigo, nausea, tremors in their limbs. Diplomats began submitting sick leave requests, citing psychosomatic disturbances, but everyone knew the cause. The Council had never faced consequence like this, not in the form of war, but in form of a presence that revealed their rot. And then, without announcement, the human delegation behind her moved only slightly, a half-step forward in perfect unison, and the entire chamber recalibrated, because they realized she was not alone, had never been alone. She was the symbol, yes, but humanity had woven itself into her silence, had made it sacred, and now, standing with her, they made it structural. The next moment came like a fault line snapping. A ship entered orbit, unauthorized, untagged, but broadcasting a signal in an ancient Earth dialect, Latin. It translated roughly as "Judgment proceeds in silence," and its silhouette was unfamiliar, sharp and angular, unlike anything the Council had seen. Earth denied knowledge of its origin, but no one believed them, because the ship bore no weapons, only a vast reflective panel across its underbelly, a mirror of sorts, aimed directly at the council building, and every day at high noon it reflected the artificial sun into the chamber ceiling, forcing light into every corner until the shadows themselves seemed to burn. People began calling it the mirror ship, and poets said it showed not light but truth, and scientists claimed it had no mass, no heat signature, yet still it existed, and theologians began to fear that it was not built by humans at all but summoned, willed into being by grief so profound it broke causality, and through it all, woman remained breathing, silent, immovable, and as the stars turned, and alliances crumbled, and new religions began to rise around the concept of her stillness, one question began to surface in every circle of power, whispered in corridors and etched into encrypted files. What happens when she speaks? Because they knew instinctively across every species that silence this profound was not infinite, it was the breath before a scream, the pressure before detonation, the pause before the divine declares itself, and when that moment came, if it came, no one would be spared from its sound. And yet, what they feared more than her words, more than her pain, more than her wrath, was the growing truth that she might never speak at all, that perhaps humanity had moved beyond words, and the woman who had lost her son had become not a diplomat, not an emissary, not a martyr, but something older, a reckoning carved into flesh, wrapped in silence, anchored by grief, and carried by a people who would never let the galaxy forget what it had done. They began to count the days, not by the Council's calendar or Earth's orbital rotations, but by the number of times she returned to the chamber and sat in silence. Each appearance was identical in form, but heavier in meaning, like a ritual deepening with every repetition. There was no schedule, no declared intention. She simply came and sat at the edge of the diplomatic circle, her body straight, her eyes fixed, her voice absent. It was not a protest, it was a presence, the kind that rewired the behavior of even the most seasoned politicians. Protocols bent around her. Conversations died in her proximity. Entire planetary representatives adjusted their schedules just to avoid speaking in her presence. Yet no one dared ask her to leave. By now the galaxy knew better. They knew what had been taken. They had seen the boy's image 1,000 times, the smiling child in the council atrium before the blast, the hopeful face that symbolized humanity's attempt to trust the wider cosmos. His loss had not simply bruised Earth's pride. It had removed the last innocent belief that diplomacy could ever be enough. And his mother, the woman who had once represented Earth's patience, now embodied its quiet judgment. She had not demanded war. She had not asked for reparations. She had only arrived again and again, as if time itself had become her message, and the stars were beginning to listen. Some called it psychological warfare. Others called it grief diplomacy, but no term captured the truth. What she was doing had no precedent. Her silence had reshaped the council chamber. Delegates who once debated with theatrical rage now spoke in whispers. Species that once flaunted power now second, guessed their own authority. The woman did nothing to enforce this. She never moved from her seat. She never so much as adjusted her posture. But when her presence coincided with the sudden resignation of the Volari ambassador or the inexplicable retreat of the Harnack fleet, patterns began to emerge. This was not coincidence. This was consequence. And no one knew what the next one would be. Earth's official diplomatic corps had grown strangely quiet as well. They issued no statements. They released no press briefings. They simply supported her by showing up in silence, dressed in dark attire, eyes forward, flanking her without words. Some held photographs of fallen humans. Others carried small objects, relics, toys, fragments of ships. They were not an army, but they carried the weight of one, and the galaxy began to realize that grief, when held by an entire species, could be heavier than any warship. One delegate, a young envoy from a minor moon on the edge of the Kasari belt, made the mistake of mocking her. He called her Earth's broken doll during a closed-door session. Within 2 rotations, his planet lost all human trade, all medical aid, all orbital maintenance. Not through a formal declaration, through silence, requests were ignored, transmissions unanswered. By the end of the week, his planet's climate control satellites began to fail. It was not sabotage. It was neglect. A neglect so absolute it became strategic. When he begged for forgiveness, when he tried to issue a formal apology, the only reply came not from her, but from Earth's most junior diplomat, who spoke one sentence into the interstellar broadcast. "Now you understand what silence feels like." That was all. But it echoed. It played again and again across the system, until even the locals stopped him in the street and asked why he had angered the woman who did not speak. It was the beginning of a new form of influence. Not through weapons, not through threats, through absence. Meanwhile, she remained unchanged. Her face bore no hatred, no outward emotion. But those who stood close claimed they felt a vibration in the air, like being near a storm that had not yet broken. Scientists attempted to analyze it. No readings appeared, no electromagnetic shifts, no gravitational flux. But still they swore something was there, a pressure in the bones, a hum just beneath the threshold of sound. And always her hands remained folded on her lap, one holding the locket, the other often stained with blood. No one knew whether the wound was ever cleaned, it never healed, and she never seemed to care. Some said it was symbolic, others said it was sacred, but no one dared offer her medical attention. The last person who tried was a Vectari physician. She reached out gently, offering a bio-salve, and the woman turned her head just slightly and said nothing. But within hours, the Vectari's own homeworld experienced a complete withdrawal of Earth's atmospheric recyclers. The message was simple: do not try to fix what you destroyed. Rumors began to spread that Earth was building something in the Uit periphery, that a new kind of envoy was being trained not to speak, but to stand, that silence itself was becoming a doctrine, a religion, a weapon, and she was its first prophet. She never acknowledged these things. She simply kept showing up, sometimes for hours, sometimes for an entire planetary cycle, and every time she did, another shift occurred, an alliance frayed, a corporation collapsed. A peace treaty faltered under the weight of human indifference. It was not revenge, it was transformation, and the galaxy began to fear what might happen if she ever decided to speak. Because if this was her silence, what would her voice sound like? Then, without announcement, a child entered the chamber, not human, not escorted, just a small being from a lesser-known species, maybe 6 years old by their calendar, wandering in through an unsecured entrance. No guards stopped them, no alarms sounded. The chamber fell into a hush as the child approached her. The woman did not move. The child stood beside her and held out a small orb glowing, pulsating with the colors of mourning used in their culture. The woman looked at the orb, then at the child, and for the first time she blinked more than once. A slow, deliberate blink, like surfacing from deep water. She took the orb, she placed it beside the locket. She looked the child in the eyes, and the child nodded, then left. No one knew what the gesture meant, but in the days that followed, the child's planet received a sudden influx of human support. Quiet shipments, advanced tech, medical teams, no official announcement, just kindness, quiet, purposeful kindness. The message was clear. It was not hatred that drove her. It was precision. It was memory, and that memory knew how to separate the guilty from the innocent. The galaxy finally understood. She was not Earth's wrath. She was Earth's memory, and Earth never forgets. But even as understanding began to spread, tension continued to build. Reports came in of new signals near the galactic rim. Signals that resembled human tech, but older, more advanced. Ghost signals. Empty broadcasts repeating phrases in ancient Earth languages. Some believed Earth had begun unlocking forgotten archives. Others feared it was something else. Something older than diplomacy, and always the mirror ship remained in orbit, reflecting the artificial sun into the council chamber at high noon. No one could stop it, no one could trace it, and every day that light seemed brighter. Sharper, as if preparing to burn away anything false, and still she remained breathing, watching, unmoving, the woman who had lost her son, the diplomat who no longer spoke, the mother who had become a monument. And every star knew it something was coming, something not loud but final, and as the light of the mirror ship etched another line across the chamber walls, a small sound broke the silence, a single breath. Not hers, but someone behind her, one of the human diplomats, a breath drawn not in fear, but in preparation, because the silence was no longer still. It was gathering, and when it broke, the galaxy would finally hear what grief sounds like when it has been weaponized by memory. They thought they had adapted to her silence, thought they had learned to live beneath the weight of her presence, like a planet adjusting to its own gravity, but the illusion shattered when she did not come. Not for a day, not for 3, not for a full week. The chair she always occupied remained untouched, its edges still faintly warm from the last time she had sat there, as if time itself refused to cool the memory. Delegates who once feared her now feared the void she left behind. Meetings resumed with forced energy, voices louder than necessary, as if shouting could erase the echo of absence. The mirror ship still hovered above the chamber, casting its noonlight blade through the dome's center. But without her there, it felt less like judgment and more like a question no one knew how to answer. Rumors began to spread like gas through vacuum corridors. Some said she had died. Some said she had returned to Earth to authorize retaliation. One fringe network claimed she had been taken by a hidden human faction too extreme even for the Council to recognize, but Earth said nothing, no messages, no confirmations. The silence had shifted shape. It was no longer presence, it was threat, and the galaxy realized too late that they had been safer when she was visible, because now no one knew what her absence meant. The tension broke not with sound, but with movement. A single human vessel, old, pre-war era, its surface blackened from atmospheric burns, exited hyperspace just outside the diplomatic zone. It did not request docking. It did not transmit credentials. It simply hovered, silent and inert, until Council ships surrounded it with caution and scanned every micron for explosives. There were none, no weapons, no passengers, no life signs. Only one object inside a small, sealed cube emitting no energy, no signals, but broadcasting a single word in ancient Terran script, return. The word looped on every readable panel, no explanation. No encryption, just the imperative. Council protocol dictated caution, perhaps destruction, but none dared touch it. The moment the cube's word was confirmed, the mirror ship blinked off gone, like a light switched from across a dimension. The sunbeam it once focused on the chamber vanished, the heat faded, shadows returned, and every representative in the council chamber felt something they had not allowed themselves to feel in weeks. Vulnerability. They held an emergency session, not to declare war or sanctions, but to admit fear. They spoke in hushed tones about how dependent they had become on her presence, even in silence, how the weight of her grief had somehow held more order than 1,000 treaties. And now that weight had shifted, not lifted, shifted, the youngest ambassador, barely 30 solar cycles old, asked a question that had no answer. If silence was stability, what is absence? It echoed through the chamber like prophecy. And though no vote was taken, no consensus reached, something unspoken passed between them all. They had to find her, not to threaten, not even to reason, but to plead, because in her silence humanity had shaped fear. In her absence they had shaped uncertainty, and they knew which was worse. Without formal declaration, dozens of ships began to search. Some were Earth's own, but most were alien species who had once distrusted, even despised humanity, now deploying their best crews in a quiet panic. The cube had said return, but return to what to her, to Earth, or to the event that had started it all the day they killed her son? The searches turned up nothing, not on Earth, not in the ruins of the council bombing site, not in the sanctum of the quiet diplomatic enclaves humans had once built on the outer moons. It was as if she had evaporated into myth, yet the consequences of her presence remained. Trade routes still destabilized. Negotiations still crumbled. Entire systems still shifted in response to what humanity no longer did. One species, the Archontel, tried to force the issue. They issued a formal call for Earth to explain her absence, and when no reply came, they declared human silence an act of war. Within 48 hours, their planetary banking system collapsed. No invasion, no weapon, just targeted currency devaluation caused by unknown human AI protocols, still active, still invisible. Their economy folded in on itself like paper in a fire. That was the message. She was not gone. She was watching. Then came the transmission, not from her, but from her son, or rather, from his voice, a fragment, a recording, played across old frequencies, one only humans had used in the earliest days of diplomacy. It repeated a simple sentence in the exact tone her son had once used when addressing the council as a child. "I believe we are meant to be kind." That was all, no timestamp, no source, just that phrase over and over until systems burned themselves trying to track its origin. Delegates cried. Some laughed nervously, as if humor could deflect the weight of the impossible. How could it be his voice? Was it archival? Was it real? Was it a message from her? But no one claimed responsibility. Earth offered no statement, and in that silence the phrase became sacred, translated into 1,000 languages, etched into walls, woven into songs, because it reminded the galaxy of what they had killed. Not just a boy, but a future, and through her silence she had made them all remember. Then a pattern emerged. Every system that had witnessed her in person began to experience phenomena not always hostile, not always measurable, but undeniable. Entire planetary ecosystems shifted slightly, responding to minor atmospheric changes. Gravity anomalies appeared where she had stood. Magnetic fields twitched. In one station, a recording device played back a conversation that had never happened, a mother saying goodbye to her child in a language the station could not identify. Scientists panicked, diplomats prayed. And still, she remained unseen, but the consequences were sharpening, as if her grief had become coded into the structure of spacetime itself. The act of killing her son had rewritten the rules, and now those rules were beginning to fold inward. Then at last Earth spoke, a brief encrypted message delivered through a closed diplomatic burst. When silence breaks, it will not be with words. That was it, no face, no signature, just that sentence. The message was clear, she was coming back, and when she returned, the galaxy would not hear her speak. They would witness something far older than language, something humanity had buried deep across centuries of restraint. Something ancient, something final, and in preparation, systems began to brace, but there was no defense against memory, no shield against loss so profound it bends the fabric of belief, because now they understood. She had not left to escape, she had left to prepare, and her return would not be a negotiation, it would be a reckoning. They had always known humanity was strange, but they had not expected this, not the slow unraveling of their confidence, not the quiet storm building behind every unanswered message, every vanished transmission, every ripple of inexplicable gravitational data that seemed to trace itself back to Earth's historical corridors of loss. In the weeks following the Council's breakdown, the galaxy held its breath, as if waiting for a verdict only one woman could deliver. And yet, the woman said nothing. She remained missing, but not forgotten. Her absence had turned sacred, her silence now studied like a holy text. There were no sightings, but there were signs, deep, unsettling signs. Gravity wells where none should be. Moons whose orbits had subtly shifted overnight. Strange auroras blooming in vacuum where no solar winds could have reached. Ships rerouted, systems flinched. Even warlords who had once barked threats at Earth now avoided naming it aloud, as if the sound of the word might summon her. One pirate cartel attempted to take advantage of the silence, raiding a diplomatic convoy headed to the Jarnoth Peace Summit. The convoy was protected by 3 species, none of them human. But within minutes of the first attack, every single ship belonging to the raiders lost control of their navigation systems, rerouted into the gravity well of a dying red dwarf, and burned. The logs showed no intrusion, no virus, no command, only one repeated message written across all cores before their destruction: she is still watching. It became clear to all she had not disappeared, she had only withdrawn. There was a difference, the kind of difference that mattered when a predator stopped moving. The Council, fractured and shamed, attempted to convene in her honor, crafting a memorial for the Son of Silence. A hollow monument made of the same metal that had once forged planetary warships. But the memorial never activated. The power source, drawn from a neutral star, simply refused to engage. Engineers could not explain it. Scientists rewired it. Diplomats prayed to it. Nothing worked. It stood there cold, lifeless, rejected by the silence it sought to honor. Some said it was a sign. Others said it was a warning, and in the shadows of their doubt, Earth remained still, still but not idle. The humans had always been known for their patience, not the soft patience of endurance, but the sharp, disciplined patience of something coiled, something waiting. And while the diplomats looked to the skies, while their ships scanned the void for her return, They missed the smaller signs, the whispers in code across the dark net of the old Terran colonies, the pulse of old emergency networks once used during the first expansion, the slow, steady reactivation of Earth's deepest artificial minds that had not spoken since the collapse. She was not alone. She never had been, and now the silence was growing teeth. One deep, space-listening post, once believed dormant, suddenly picked up a ripple, not a signal, not a transmission, but a memory wave, something older than light, older than language. A child's heartbeat, faint but real, matched, verified, and impossible. It was the boy's heartbeat, the very same cadence recorded in his last medical entry before the Council's attack. The recording shook the scientific community to its core. How could that data exist? How could it travel? And why now? Why here? Theories emerged, none with evidence. Some suggested that her grief had created a quantum anchor, a permanent scar in time that now leaked his essence into real space. Others said she had never truly buried him, that she had kept some fragment of him alive in ways no one understood. But none of them could deny what followed. Hundreds of thousands of citizens across dozens of worlds began to report dreams. Not nightmares, not hallucinations, dreams, the same one. A woman walking through a storm of shattered stars, holding the hand of a boy who no longer cast a shadow. No matter the species, no matter the neural architecture. They all described it the same way. She never spoke. Neither did the boy, but they walked, and the stars parted, and every person who woke from that dream wept without knowing why. Entire governments began to collapse under the weight of their own fear. Not of war, not even of death, but of guilt. Guilt they had buried too long. Guilt they could no longer explain away. They had thought themselves clever for negotiating with Earth, for using diplomacy to contain the Deathworlders, for controlling what they believed were the instincts of a savage species raised in violence. But they had misunderstood everything. Earth had never been tamed. Humanity had only chosen peace, and when they killed her son, they killed the reason for that choice. And now she walked somewhere beyond their reach, no longer interested in talking, no longer tethered to the diplomatic lines they had spent centuries weaving like spider silk across civilizations. A group of religious leaders convened on the planet Vainol, declaring the silence not merely a political event, but a cosmic reckoning, the grief of a mother elevated to divine consequence. They began to preach a new theology. She does not speak because the galaxy no longer deserves her words. The sermon spread. Civil unrest followed. Colonies that had voted to sanction Earth now reversed their decisions, issuing apologies broadcast to the void, never answered. Still, she did not return. Until one night, across the oldest satellite Earth had ever launched, the one still orbiting its moon, long forgotten, mostly ceremonial, a message appeared, not a signal, not a video. Just a shadow, impossible in vacuum, cast across the satellite's lens, the outline of a woman standing still, holding the frame of a child in her arms. The shadow did not move, did not change, but every telemetry instrument on the satellite went offline within seconds. The satellite began transmitting a phrase not part of its programming, not stored in any backup system. When she stands still, the stars remember. That was all. It repeated until the power bled dry. Within hours, images flooded social networks across human and alien systems alike. People painting that silhouette, children drawing her shape into dust with their fingers, pilots tracing her outline into asteroid fields with navigation lights. She had become more than human. She had become myth, and yet the myth was real because the consequences of her pain kept shaping physics, rewriting the gravity of trust itself. Then Earth finally opened the vault. It was not a warhead, not a fleet, not a diplomatic statement. It was something worse. It was a recording, a video message recorded by her son, not as a child, but as a young teenager, weeks before the attack. In it, he stood in front of a viewing panel, Earth visible behind him, stars folding through the sky. He smiled, he was happy, and he spoke, not about treaties, not about the council, but about her. He said, "If something ever happens to me and she stops speaking, do not try to make her talk again. Just listen, because her silence is the only thing keeping you safe." He laughed then, the kind of laugh only the loved and unbroken know how to offer. And then the message ended, no encryption, no edit, just that, and they listened and they understood, and it was too late. Because by the time they replayed it, the gravity waves had already begun. Across 3 sectors, time began to misalign by microseconds. Ships drifted off course, memories glitched in organic minds, and those who stood closest to the epicenter to Earth began to feel a pressure that could not be named, like something behind them was watching, waiting, counting every breath. Because silence was never absence. It was the sound before the storm, and now the wind had started to rise. They thought her silence was surrender. They thought a mother who would not speak was a mother who would not fight. But silence is not always the absence of a weapon. Sometimes it is the sound a blade makes before it strikes. Somewhere beyond the marble corridors of the Galactic Council, beyond the polished words of envoys who bow and smile and lie, a secret war has already begun. While they debate her in hushes and coded messages, while they spin her grief into political currency, she sits still in her chamber, eyes half closed, every heartbeat echoing in places no microphone can catch. And somewhere far from that chamber, in the veins of ships that cross old trade routes and abandoned listening posts, where ghosts of empires whisper through broken speakers, a message moves like a pulse. Her silence is the code. Her silence is the command. Humanity's last emissary never needed to raise her voice, because she carries something far older than language. She carries memory, the kind that survives in the marrow, the kind that can pass through sealed doors and encrypted frequencies, waking old promises. One by one they rise, men and women, children of a dying Earth who learn to hide knives beneath their soft words, soldiers who once laid down their guns for treaties that turned to ash. They have no flags now, no rank. They wear the ordinary faces of starship engineers, agricultural liaisons, cultural attaches invisible until the silence calls them home. They rise in mining colonies where the sky is never blue, in orbital hotels where dignitaries sleep drunk on stolen luxuries, in the poison corridors of stations drifting between black holes. They do not speak. They do not threaten. They do what she asked them to do without ever hearing her voice. They listen, they watch, they wait, and when the time comes, they strike not like an army, but like a memory you cannot bury. In the hidden decks of a research freighter that once belonged to a peaceful biological guild, 2 agents stand shoulder to shoulder over a trembling official. He swears he never knew the strike on Earth would kill a child. He says the targeting systems were manipulated. He says he only followed orders. But when he looks at the woman before him, the one who left her name behind on Europa's frozen archives, he sees no mercy in her eyes. Only reflection. She does not flinch when he tries to bargain. She does not answer when he begs for the council's due process. She lifts her wrist, and an old code sings through the air a strand of silence. The shape of her absence and the ship's lights flicker as the room fills with the final hush he will ever know. There is no record of his execution. There is no statement to the council. His body drifts into a star's embrace while the agents disappear into the next transmission, leaving behind no more than a rumor. The silent mother's grief moves in the dark. Elsewhere, in the shimmering corridors of a trade embassy on the moons of Hava, another operative steps through a ballroom where the galaxy's powerful drink toasts over the ashes of a forgotten world. He wears the skin of a cultural diplomat, his eyes warm, his smile broad, his tongue fluent in a dozen alien dialects that taste of honey and venom. He laughs at their jokes, praises their ships, compliments their children's holographic plays. And when he excuses himself from the table, he slips a deed into the pocket of a traitor who once sold the coordinates of a diplomatic convoy to the same race that now fears her silence. Within hours, the seed will sprout inside every unsecured relay, turning secrets into confessions, confessions into names, names into targets. He sends no report. He does not need to. Her silence is his confirmation. The galaxy keeps dancing in ignorance while ghosts move under its floorboards, shaking foundations that once seemed too ancient to crumble. In dreams, she remembers their faces. She sees her son's smile as he builds a toy starship on a quiet afternoon no diplomat ever witnessed. She sees the distant suns reflected in the eyes of operatives she trained not with weapons, but with the promise that one day a wordless command would come, and when it did, they would know exactly what to do. She remembers how they once gathered in dusty meeting rooms on Earth's last night of innocence, arguing over codes and protocols while her child slept in her arms. She remembers signing no orders, only telling them, when the silence comes, remember who you are. They remembered. Ships fall silent as sabotage crawls through their veins like an old disease. Power brokers wake to find their security shadows turned against them, an escort who vanishes in the dark, an assistant who was never really an assistant, a steward who unlocks a door that should have never existed. They die in garden suites overlooking orbital rings, or on lonely walks through gardens of cultivated moons. They die quickly, some with understanding in their eyes, some cursing a name they will never hear spoken aloud. Not a single statement is issued, not a single monument is built. All that remains is the widening hush in council chambers where once great conquerors now tremble behind rhetorical walls. They wonder when she will speak. They wonder if the next sound she makes will be forgiveness or extinction. Yet even as the hidden war blooms in the dark, doubt creeps through corridors meant to feel safe. Some humans question whether vengeance will resurrect what was lost. Some operatives falter when they see innocent eyes caught between crossfires of old betrayal. In the wreckage of a casino satellite drifting too close to the red storms of Orpheus Prime, an agent kneels beside a child whose parents fell to an accident. That was no accident at all. He should finish his task, disappear, carry the hush onward. But the child's sobs reach something deeper than protocol. He whispers a single forbidden word, "Mother," and in that fragile moment, the silence feels less like a blade and more like a wound that never healed. Far away, she sits in her chamber, palms pressed against the cold metal floor, as if feeling the pulse of every secret action, every broken vow paid back in shadows. She does not see the tears of her agents. She does not hear their doubts, but she feels something shift in the currents of unspoken trust. The grief that drives them threatens to become the same violence that once shattered her son's smile. A message reaches her through old neural implants buried beneath layers of diplomatic implants and ceremonial bindings. 3 words, pulsing behind her eyes like the last heartbeat of a dying star. We are ready. She knows what they mean, the final names, the last betrayers, the heart of the hidden rot that turned a boy's laugh into cosmic silence. They ask for her voice now, for a final blessing, but her lips do not part. Instead, she stands alone in a room that hums with the weight of invisible legions, and steps toward the window that looks out into the swirl of the council's cradle. A world that pretends it is safe because its walls shine so bright. They say she has never killed with her own hand. They are wrong. Her silence kills more cleanly than any gun or blade. Her silence breaks empires because it starves them of excuses, because it feeds only the part of a human soul that remembers what was taken and what must never be allowed again. And yet tonight, as the hidden war devours the last shadows of a lie that killed her child, she wonders if a blade that cuts so deeply can ever stop. If her grief is not only a weapon, but a contagion, a grief that will outlive her, passed like an infection through eyes and memories and whispered vows to never forgive. In the council's marble halls, word reaches trembling ears that another traitor fell tonight. A general with eyes like molten copper, who once signed a secret accord that traded Earth's trust for unholy promises of protection, lies on his knees before the silent emissary. They dragged him through a hidden corridor, past bewildered guards who dared not speak. Now he begs for mercy in the cold glow of her shadow. She does not lift a hand. She does not turn her gaze. She steps forward once, and he flinches as if the sound of her footfall might be the last thing he ever hears. He sobs a name, her son's name, trying to twist it into an apology. But no apology can live inside the hush she carries like a crown of broken stars. He lowers his head, trembling, whispering that he only did what he thought would keep the galaxy safe. She steps past him. She does not stop when his voice cracks into a whimper. She does not pause when the hidden pulse behind her eyes transmits a final silent verdict. His scream does not echo long. Only the hush remains. And somewhere deep in the council's archives, an old security system flickers to life, feeding images into channels that were never meant to open. Holographic fragments slip through cracks in locked vaults, truths no longer contained by secrecy or threat. A truth that will force the council's hand. A truth that will put not just her, but every species on trial for crimes hidden behind treaties and false flags and the polite lies of ancient empires. She does not smile when the alarm lights up the sky beyond her window. She does not weep when she feels the final doors break. She closes her eyes, remembering the warmth of a child's laughter before politics made him a target. And when the guards pound on her chamber door, shouting for answers they are too late to contain, the silent mother stands alone in the storm she unleashed, knowing that the next voice to break this hush will not be hers, it will be the universe itself demanding judgment for every secret buried. Under the weight of her silence, ***, she lifts her head as the doors burst open, and somewhere in the chaos beyond, a voice whispers, "It is time for the trial." ***, they came for her in the false dawn, when the corridors of the convocation still whispered with half-forgotten prayers that order might survive one more cycle. They thought they could drag her in chains of protocol and polite terror, parade her grief beneath marble arches polished by centuries of lies, force her to surrender her silence before a court that never really judged itself. They were wrong. When they opened her chamber door, they did not find a prisoner. They found a verdict waiting for its sentence. She rose without protest, eyes calm, wrists free of any bind they could see. She walked between armored guards who dared not meet her gaze. Around them, the council's great halls bloomed alive with rumor and fear species that once thought themselves immortal now shifted in uneasy clusters, wondering if the hush that haunted their dreams would finally break and reveal how fragile their illusions really were. The chamber they led her into was older than most of the stars these delegates claimed to own. Its pillars hummed with histories too heavy to translate, stories carved in scripts no envoy could fully erase. She stood alone at its heart, a single silent human in a sea of scaled monarchs, winged arbitrators, crystalline seers who pulsed with light that flickered like desperate questions. No chains held her, yet none could say she was free. A voice boomed, ceremonial, cowardly, wrapped in the armor of collective authority. They spoke of crimes unspeakable, of war unleashed in shadows, of assassinations whispered through dead calms, of fleets moved without permission. They called her an architect of chaos, a betrayer of the trust Earth once promised when it knelt to this council's peace. Yet every word fell against her silence like arrows against a wall that did not bleed. When they demanded she speak, she did not. When they threatened punishment, she did not flinch. Instead, she lifted one hand, a gesture so small it took the entire chamber a breath to understand it was a command. And then the room changed. The ancient walls shimmered, the pillars bent light into forms they could not deny. Without a single word, she turned the trial meant for her into a mirror so vast it swallowed every lie they had ever told. Images bloomed in the air, flickering, raw, unedited truths that no species here could pretend were fiction. The last day on Earth played out for all to see her son's laughter, his small hands pressing a model starship into her palm, the distant rumble of betrayal that split the sky before he ever knew fear. They watched the strategic misfire. That was no misfire at all, the Allied fleet's cold trajectory that turned a diplomatic world into an execution ground. They saw the coded transmissions traded behind secure council vaults, signatories who sold one planet's child for another's illusion of safety. They saw treaties signed with blood disguised as ink. They saw secret handshakes hidden behind oaths of unity. They saw themselves, reflected in the cruelty they always blamed on others. Silence filled the chamber thicker than any voice could. Some rose from their seats, scales bristling, wings quivering, skins of living metal humming with static dread. Some tried to shout this was falsified, human trickery, an ancient trick of digital sorcery. But the memories did not flicker like forgeries. They pulsed with the truth only grief can carry, a mother's memories woven into her mind, sealed in the organic vault of a brain that could not lie about what it lost. Even those who hated her felt something break inside when they saw the boy's small body, ashes cradled in trembling hands that once shaped words of peace. They looked at her, and some for the first time truly saw her. Not a silent threat, not a monster in human skin, but a wound given breath. Some begged her then, speak now, speak anything, forgive us, condemn us. Just make a sound so we know which God to pray to when the stars grow quiet. But her lips did not move. Her silence was not punishment anymore. It was an answer so final it left them to argue with themselves. Factions splintered under the weight of proof. Old alliances cracked like glass under a winter boot. Civilizations that swore eternal loyalty to the Council now whispered rebellion. Species who lost children to secret wars saw in her loss a reflection of their own stolen futures. In the hush she offered no vengeance, only a truth so unvarnished it cut deeper than any fleet ever could. One by one they rose to speak, not for her but for themselves. Some cursed the humans for exposing old sins. Some wept for the boy they never knew yet could not stop mourning. Some promised reparations, shallow gifts pressed like coins on a grave that would never be enough. And in that swelling storm of voices she stood unmoving, a lighthouse in a sea of rhetorical thunder. The council speaker, a creature of 1,000 fractal eyes, demanded order, but there was no order left to enforce. The chamber trembled with the question no law could contain. What do we do now that we know who we really are? In the viewing galleries high above, silent messengers ran frantic relays to their worlds, their governments, their secret keepers. Ships powered up in hidden bays, some ready to run, some ready to strike. Assassins weighed costs and benefits. Kill her now, kill the evidence, kill the story, but all saw in her stillness a terrifying possibility, that if they silenced her body, her silence would become a legend that would outlive them all. Better, some thought, to bend, to kneel, to spin her grief into a new doctrine they could wear like armor against the chaos she unveiled. But not all agreed. Deep in the shadows behind the grand chamber's vaulted screens, voices met in hushes sharper than any spoken threat. Species who built their empires on secrets saw extinction waiting if this trial continued. They plotted escape tunnels through false neutrality, laid plans for hidden strikes, coded dead man switches into remote fleets. In corners of the chamber's massive mind, old enemies forged new pacts in the span of a heartbeat. If she would not be silenced by shame, perhaps she would drown in the noise of war reborn. Yet while the powerful clawed at the old world's dying walls, something else shifted in the air around her. Not fear, not rage, something small, impossibly fragile, a new kind of hush, not imposed by terror but grown from the raw soil of shared grief. It moved first through those who lost children, then through species too young to have yet learned to lie well enough to survive the council's labyrinth. A mother from the crystalline choir knelt first, her facets flickering blue with morning songs. A scaled merchant of the rim lowered his head, pressing his claws into his chest where his child's heartbeat once lived before pirates funded by secret council charters took it away. One by one, beings born of worlds the council never cared to name offered her the only thing they had left, the truth that her silence had become theirs too. Amid this fragile birth of something vast and unstoppable, a single figure emerged, small, trembling, not a diplomat, not a warrior, not a spy. A child, eyes wide with questions too big for any language to hold. An orphan lifted from the wreckage of a colony that fell in the first hidden strike of this war. The council's bailiffs shoved the child forward, hoping the innocence might shame her into a word, force her to confess some shred of guilt, or at least prove she was still human enough to care. The chamber watched breathless. Would the silent mother finally speak? Would her silence crack under the weight of this tiny mirror of what she lost? She did not move. She did not bend to lift the child. She simply opened her hand, not to pull him close, but to show him the space she still carried where her own child once rested his head. The child stepped forward, tiny fingers brushing the cold metal edge of her ceremonial robe. In his eyes was not fear, but a plea so old it made the council's ancient walls seem newborn. Do not let them lie about me when I am gone. And in that moment, for the first time since she boarded the vessel that carried her silence across dying stars. A crack appeared at the corner of her lips, not a word, but the shape of one being born. Before she could shape it, the chamber erupted, some rushing to shield the child, others screaming for her arrest, some falling to their knees in awe, some reaching for hidden weapons they had not yet dared to show. Above it all, her eyes lifted, not to the child, but to the great vaulted ceiling painted with the stars these species swore they owned. And, in the hush between the child's breath and the council's roar, she knew this trial was never hers to survive. It was the galaxy's chance to decide what it would be when the silence ended. And as the lights flickered and the guards closed in, she whispered, not yet with her eyes alone, for the doctrine of silent judgment was just beginning to write its first word. In the days after the trial that was never hers alone, the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see if the silence that cracked open so many secrets would ever speak again. Across worlds still spinning in the gravity of old lies, beings gathered in temples of steel and glass, on crumbling ruins of orbital stations, in dark market alleys where truth was traded for survival, and everywhere they gathered, they repeated the same impossible question: if she will not speak, then what does her silence mean for us? Ships drifted through forgotten corridors of deep space, broadcasting her image on infinite loops. A woman unmoving at the heart of a galaxy that suddenly had to listen for what it could no longer pretend not to hear. Some called her saint, some monster, some last judge of a species too reckless to survive its own tongue. But for the first time since the council carved the void into pieces and called it order, entire civilizations found themselves united by a single unspoken vow: no more easy words. At first, it began as rumor, a whisper between lovers who lost families to council sanctions, a prayer uttered by parents who saw in her silence the only armor strong enough to shield their children from history's endless hunger. Then the rumor became ritual. On distant mining moons, workers who once spent their breath cursing their masters gathered in silent vigils, standing side by side through the darkness between shifts, refusing to speak to overseers who profited from the weight of their complaints. On ocean worlds where treaties once banned song because it threatened to unite too many voices, families gathered on salt, crusted shores, holding each other's hands, facing the tides with sealed lips, because the ocean did not need their words to know them. Even in the grand chambers of the council that once tried to break her quiet resolve, diplomats found themselves stumbling over scripted speeches as factions adopted the doctrine of silent judgment like a contagion they could not vaccinate against. Silence, once a threat, now became a shield, a weapon, a law that no sword could pierce. But as this new doctrine spread, so did its contradictions. Empires who once feared her hush now twisted it into commandments of convenience. Whole governments declared days of silence to mask atrocities committed in the name of peace. Mercenary fleets painted her symbol the closed mouth of a grieving mother on their hulls before raising dissident colonies, claiming their bombs were silent prayers for future harmony. In darkened council chambers, elder species who once traded in rumors now sat in orchestrated silence during votes, each quiet pause more terrifying than 1,000 shouted threats. Children born on border stations learned first to hold their tongue before they learned to shape words, because to speak too soon was to risk naming a truth that might kill them faster than any bullet. Amid this chaos disguised as revelation, She remained as she always was, a single figure moving through corridors now lined with statues of her likeness, each sculpted by hands that could not decide if they were building an idol or a tombstone. She did not write the doctrine. She did not sign its charters. She did not bless the pilgrims who came to lay shards of shattered starships at her feet. Offerings of ruin they claimed were her burden to carry. She only watched, eyes wide open, as species turned her grief into a currency too valuable to spend honestly. And yet beneath the opportunists and the tyrants who draped themselves in her silence, something genuine still moved like a current too deep to see. In back alleys and secret rooms, the broken and the exiled began to gather, not just to mimic her hush, but to understand it. They spoke softly of a galaxy that might one day be brave enough to stand still, to listen before it threatened, to weep before it bombed, to hold the ashes of its mistakes and promise never to scatter them carelessly again. Everywhere she went, new factions rose to claim her meaning. The disciples of the hushed breath declared silence a holy sacrament. Their acolytes ripped out their own tongues to prove devotion, leaving their stumps as testament to pain given shape. On moons where language once forged alliances, warlords forbade speech altogether, claiming only the strong could thrive when the weak could not beg for mercy with trembling pleas. Universities that once trained negotiators now offered entire degrees in the study of the unspoken lectures that began with a single word and ended in hours of collective silence, students staring into the eyes of professors who dared them to grasp ideas no tongue could hold. Still, the woman at the center of this new faith, this twisted salvation, this fear reborn in reverence, she spoke nothing. She walked hallways where dignitaries trembled in her wake. She sat before committees who asked her for a blessing they did not deserve. She stood beside orphans left behind by the same hidden war she had dragged into daylight, children who looked up at her and wondered if a galaxy that finally shut its mouth could ever learn to listen with its heart. And always, when they asked her with wide eyes and quiet gestures what her silence meant, she answered with the same small truth: an open palm, a quiet gaze, a wound that refused to close until the galaxy learned why it must never forget how it was made. In the shadows of this fragile awakening, old monsters stirred. The council fractured, but did not vanish. Too many ancient debts tied its splintered limbs together like bone held by brittle wire. Former allies plotted to break her doctrine from within, to plant agents among the faithful, to twist the silence into a reason for new wars fought under the banner of wordless consent. Propaganda reels spun stories that she had spoken in secret, given orders, signed declarations of conquest that no one could prove, but everyone was willing to fear. Some believed she was already dead, a puppet of hidden operatives who wore her face like a mask, while real humans built fleets in the dark, ready to silence any who refused to kneel. Yet beneath every lie, her presence remained undeniable. She did not flinch when they brought her corpses dressed in ceremonial garb, claiming these were the price of silence unchecked. She did not bend when crowds of grieving parents demanded she punish the council's children as theirs had been punished. She did not bow when new rulers offered her thrones carved from old tyrants' bones. Instead, she sat in a room not much larger than the one where she once cradled her son's ashes, a chamber stripped of gold and marble, its walls bare, but for the echoes of a question no one yet dared answer aloud. What happens when she finally speaks? They gathered outside her door each dawn, now believers, skeptics, killers disguised as guards, children who did not know what to pray for but came anyway because in her silence they saw the chance to be heard by something greater than themselves. Rumors said that on the next council cycle, she would break her vow that the doctrine of silent judgment would end with a word that might burn entire empires to cinders or lift the galaxy to a peace it could not yet imagine. In refugee camps orbiting dead worlds, entire families huddled around flickering feeds, eyes wide, breath held, waiting to see if the woman who taught the stars how to hush would finally teach them how to speak again. And in that hush, standing at the edge of a galaxy so afraid of its own voice it had forgotten the sound of its heartbeat, she closed her eyes and felt the weight of every silent prayer pressed against her ribs like old scars. She knew that when she spoke, it would not be her voice alone, but the echo of every mother who buried a child in soil or stardust and vowed to never let the lie of polite peace stand unchallenged again. She opened her eyes to the window of her chamber where distant stars blinked like the promise of a word not yet born. And somewhere beyond that cold glass, a single syllable gathered in the darkness, waiting for her breath to bring it alive at last. For 1,000 days they feared her silence, for 1,000 nights they worshipped it. But when the last emissary of earth finally parts her lips, the word that crosses the void will not shatter worlds with fire, it will unravel them with truth. When she rose, the air in that endless hall seemed to collapse in on itself, as if the gravity of her grief could pull entire species to their knees before her voice had even formed its shape. Outside, ships drifted in tight orbits around the council citadel, each hull humming with anxious transmissions that would never be spoken aloud until they knew